When we think about our loved ones being in a nursing home, it's a different kind of feeling than when we're not seeing them in the day-to-day. The vulnerability, the concern for the vulnerability, and to have some objective information to use to combat something that sometimes might feel like speculation.
Welcome to the NCEA's Conversations on Aging and Justice podcast and our series on ethics in elder mistreatment. Join us in examining ethical dilemmas in elder abuse prevention and intervention while considering principles of autonomy, consent, and justice for older adults. Can a camera safeguard residents in long-term care facilities, or might it impinge upon one's privacy? For residents in long-term care and their families, surveillance can be a complex and nuanced issue. While cameras and other devices can offer information about the type of care residents are receiving and how they're being treated by staff, other residents, and visitors, they may be invasive and potentially violate privacy rights. Today, we delve into these critical issues with Lori Smetanka and Leilani Pelletier. Lori Smetanka is the Executive Director of the National Consumer Voice for Quality Long-Term Care, the leading national nonprofit advocacy organization representing consumers receiving long-term care and services in nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and home and community-based settings. Leilani Pelletier has more than 3 decades of experience leading advocacy and strategic growth initiatives, fueled and inspired by a background in direct care to older individuals. She was named Ohio's State Long-Term Care Ombudsman in June 2024. We hope you enjoyed this engaging and informative conversation.
And when we talk about surveillance in nursing homes and cameras in nursing homes, what are you finding that the families and residents, why are they looking to use cameras in their skilled nursing facilities?
I first started hearing about the use of surveillance cameras in nursing homes, or granny cams, they used to be called, maybe about 20 years ago, when family members were trying to put hidden cameras into their loved ones' rooms because they were concerned about the care and services that the residents were receiving. They either were concerned that they weren't receiving proper services or care, that they were being neglected. And it's been an issue that's come up through the years. You may see where there would be a hidden camera that was put in that captured some abusive situation. Media attention would follow that situation, and then there'd be a flurry of activities in either the state in which that happened or in other states to try to do something about that issue and provide some support for families that were interested or in putting the cameras in, or for some to deny them that ability. And it's every few years, you see something like this come up, to where now we see that maybe close to half of states have some sort of law or rule or policy on the books where there are provisions relating to the use of these cameras. And I think that some people still want to use them to monitor care, to hopefully be a deterrent to abuse. But I also do think that, particularly with COVID, that there are some that are looking at how not only cameras, but how electronic devices can be used as a means of checking in on their loved one. When people were kept out of nursing homes, when nursing homes were closed and family members couldn't visit, that they were looking for other methods or mechanisms to not only keep eyes on their loved ones, because that was really important, but also to keep connection. And I know, Leilani, that over the last couple of years in Ohio, that you all have undertaken implementation of a law, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what that process looked like in your state.
Sure. Thanks for this. And as to the why, our experience in Ohio is exactly almost right along the line as you stated it. In Ohio, very particularly, our law is called Esther's Law. If you visit our website, we have quite a bit of a story about it. Dave Piskor, the son of Esther, worked very hard to have this law passed truly for the classic surveillance purposes, truly driven out of need or concern to mitigate potential abuse, neglect, to stay connected, to perhaps sometimes the desire is to show what for example, a family member might truly believe is going on, and they might have evidence or concern ahead of time, and they might want to bring that camera in, hoping to use that as evidence as well.
I don't think that it's always smooth sailing for
Right.
efforts to pass this legislation. We know, that in some states they have tried multiple years to pass that. There are some that are against the use of cameras in long-term care facilities. And, maybe you can start us off, Leilani, with talking about like what you saw as some of the reasons for or against as you were looking to pass the legislation in Ohio.
Back in around September, about 2011, there had been that hidden camera use that you were talking about as well. Driven from that experience of capturing some abuse and hidden cameras, that's when really the thought was born. And it's kind of hard to make an argument against it. There were lots of ethical questions to answer about how that worked. But really, when you experience an instance like we did with family, it's really hard to make a good case against being able to stop something like this. And this was at the heart of that law. It's using this one tool to stop it. It's eyes and ears in a place that otherwise demands some privacy or privacy is expected. When we think about our loved ones being in a nursing home, it's a different kind of feeling than when we're not seeing them in the day-to-day. The vulnerability, the concern for the vulnerability, and to have some objective information to use to combat something that sometimes might feel like speculation.
I mean, I think, the concern about the care particularly if you can't be there on a regular basis, those are reasons why, people are wanting to put cameras in the room. As I mentioned earlier, some were thinking that they can be a deterrent, particularly if you know that a camera is recording what you're doing. The argument goes that as a staff person, you're more likely to make sure you're doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing, that, that if you're being recorded, you're hopefully more likely to stay in control of your emotions, not be abusive, ensure that, you're following proper procedures, that you're actually providing the care that's necessary. There are concerns about their use, though, particularly related to the privacy of the individuals that are being recorded. Some electronic equipment only do video, some only do audio, and some do both. And I think that, we're increasingly seeing with the advent of technology that both audio and video are being recorded, and privacy issues are one of the biggest concerns. And not only of the person who's kind of the object of the recording, the resident on whom the camera is focused, of their roommates, of other people that would be coming and going into the room and into the area that could be captured by the recording, visitors, physicians. And I think that's why the laws have been so important. We created a fact sheet a few years ago of different considerations that people should think about if they're wanting some surveillance in a particular room. And certainly people need to ask about whether or not there is a law or some guidelines in the state. And the laws cover a lot of different elements. They cover issues like ensuring privacy of the resident and their roommate. They cover things with respect to who has control over the camera and the footage that may be recorded and what can be done with that information. What kind of consent has to be provided? Sometimes it's very particular with respect to the kind of consent that has to be provided. Do other people need to be notified, that there are cameras in the room? I was in a nursing home in Texas last year where there were signs on the doors that indicated that electronic device that had recording capability was being used in a particular room. To the greatest extent possible, we should be informing people, about what is happening, but then giving the resident the choice as to whether or not they want those devices in the first place, and to be really guiding how they're used in their own rooms and in monitoring their care.
People come into facilities with cameras and start filming and taping and don't check policies, and who knows where that footage is going, and it ends up all sorts of places. So I think it's important to consider not just the ethics of cameras in the room, but ethics of the overall ethics of what else could be happening.
The laws in the states cover a whole variety of issues, but a lot of them are designed to help protect the people who may be recorded, whether it be intentional or inadvertent, and ensure that privacy rights are being respected. And I think you include some of those in your law in Ohio, right, Leilani?
We do, right? Obviously, at the core of all of this and at the core of all of the ethics, I wouldn't be an ombudsman if I didn't talk first and foremost about the individual's right to self-determination for all residents, and that they be particularly in this area, first and foremost in that decision-making element. That is the overarching ethical theme for me as an individual. There are many ethical themes in surveillance, but first and foremost is that no matter what law allows what, when we're looking to support and enforce and ensure individual rights of residents in their long-term care setting, that self-determination is key and critical. In Ohio, as this was sponsored and legislated, that consideration for example, you share a room with another individual, that individual, so we're not talking about the person quite yet. We'll definitely get there when we get to some of the other considerations. So the other person in the room impacted, or their proper representative would need to agree, certainly. And if that individual did not agree, then the facility is basically compelled to find a workaround about how that can be addressed, perhaps with another room for those being requested. There's a requirement to manage that if the roommate does not consent to having that. So that's what we did in terms of the roommate. And certainly in the legislation, it talks about who authorizes the camera that is used with a certain resident. So the roommate is one thing, but then we'll talk more about the individual's decision and how that should be addressed and handled when there's a desire for a camera.
Absolutely. And the resident absolutely needs to be involved, not only in the placement, but also in terms of how it's used. So, is it going to be on all the time? Or will there be certain times when the camera or the recording device should be turned off when personal care is being provided, for example, or if the doctor comes in for a visit and they're talking about the person's, health and well-being, or the care that's being provided to them, or if they have a visitor that they want a private conversation with, ensuring that there's the ability to stop recording whenever the resident wants to have some more privacy, and ensure that that's being respected.
And ensuring that there is, just like we have in Ohio too, specifying that the authorization can be revoked, so many times we get into a habit, or we forget how things originated, or make assumptions about what can change in our own long-term care situation, even spelling it out that if you authorize something like that, that doesn't mean that you can't revoke that authorization at some point. Again, the individual's self-determination and that individual's understanding of what this is. We should not be making assumptions that that individual has been properly informed of the understanding of where that camera goes, what's happening with the footage, where is it being stored. It is incumbent upon us to make sure that not only are there questions answered if they're considering this, sometimes there's not answers, but to not assume that the individual understands things as we understand them, checking back in, not just are you okay with it, but do you understand what could happen with this camera? Do you understand what accidents might happen? We don't have all the answers, but boy, those conversations really need to be held with that individual and give them time to make those decisions. Many times, a family may feel very strongly about it and want it and have particular reason for wanting it. They may or may not have anything to do with the resident that we're talking about today. It could be a family history. It could be a fear. It could be seeing one video that showed the worst of what can happen, and they're so inspired. If that resident wants that for whatever reason, that's their reason, right? So we need to be sure when we're talking about this too, though, that even though the family may want it, we have to talk to the resident about this first, and we need to try more than once, right? So, the ability to make a decision like that when you're in a vulnerable space about putting a camera in, it might feel really clear from an outside perspective about why we should do that. And people want to tell us what we should do. But really, truly stop and put yourself in that resident's place. It might be that their concern about abuse or neglect is not the same concern that someone else might have, right? So we don't want to default to the wrong decision makers. A bottom line, first and foremost, should be that resident living in the situation. What is their concern? What do they want? Do they understand the options? And make sure we do our more than due diligence over one occasion whenever possible to make sure that the choice lies with that individual. When it's very clear through a very clear process that they're not able to make an informed decision for one reason or another, then we make sure we move on to the next proper decision-making authority. But boy, if there's ever anything we need to double time our efforts on, it's making sure the person who's going to have the camera on them at all times truly understands what that is before they either agree to it, and that we've given it all our full attention. And sometimes, it's not on admission day that we want to do that. Do you have any unintended consequences or things that kind of might not pan out the way we might think they would with a camera in the room?
You see what the camera's focused on. You don't see everything that's going on around it.
Right. It only captures, in many cases, whereas if it's in the room on the bed, that's just captures what's in the room and on the bed. And for those residents that maybe don't spend a lot of time in their room, as you think about what kind of questions you should ask or talk with the resident about, think about that camera being in your most private space of your home. And yes, not saying that it's not a good thing to have, because in some cases it really can be. Faraway family that can't get their eyes on someone or really wants to monitor what's happening in that very vulnerable space. But that's very true, because sometimes the signs or indicators of concern can happen way off camera.
Sometimes there can be misinterpretation from what you see, although sometimes it's very clear, what you're seeing too.
Yes.
So we certainly have seen that cameras have been used to start investigations,
Yes.
or have been used in court cases, have been used in efforts to hold the facility liable for different elements of abuse and neglect, or even people, who may have been abusive. I think, though, that the recording is a tool. It's one piece of evidence, and it does not negate the fact that a full investigation, needs to occur about what happened. Some of the state laws do address liability issues, particularly with respect to protecting from invasions of privacy. But I think in most states, the recordings can be used in efforts to hold liable someone who may be responsible for abusing or neglecting a resident. And it's one of the pieces of evidence that can be used and submitted. One of the things that we see and talk about with respect to the use of cameras is that they are not a substitute for personal interaction, for actual in-person visitation whenever that's possible, for on-site monitoring of care. And we don't want to think that the use of a camera is going to ensure that that person is 100% protected. It's easy to give a false sense of security when there is a camera. They go, well, just because the camera's on, I know that the person will be okay. It's really important to continue to maintain that in-person contact and connection as much as possible, and recognizing that that may be difficult. Family does not live nearby, but as often as people can be going in and visiting their family member, their friends, their loved ones, either themselves or having other people who are on site and helping to connect with them, is really important. Far too many residents don't have in-person visitors who come on a regular basis. And so the electronic devices can definitely help with enhancing those connections, but we should not rely on them as a sole substitute for that personal interaction. Certainly, as we're seeing, more thoughtfulness going into the creation of these laws and different elements being encompassed into the laws, and I think that many of them are being developed to protect the privacy rights, to protect the overarching rights of the individuals that may want to use them. As states continue to think about what the different elements are that they want to include as they consider legislation, certainly privacy rights, I think, are really important that they need to be incorporating. Again, focusing in on who has control of the device and the recordings. Certainly that needs to be in line with the resident and their representatives to ensure that they're the ones that have control of that, getting permissions and consent from the proper people who need to provide it. That includes the roommates or others who may be coming and going in the facility. There are some states that actually have consent forms that they've included in their provisions. They need to be looking at who's responsible for the operation and maintenance of the device, and they be looking at how the information can be used, making sure there are protections so that it's not misused by the wrong parties, and also ensuring that there's notice to individuals who may be coming and going from the room. But again, really thinking about when is that device going to be used, and ensuring that the residents' privacy and dignity is protected in any of its use. And certainly as facilities are thinking about the ethical aspects of those are some that they would want to consider, and also to develop policies. I think we've talked about, a lot of the different aspects, but certainly this needs to be a conscious decision that is involving and really directed by the resident and what it is that they want. You've just said that so well, Leilani, throughout, that a resident really needs to be the one who directs whether and how a camera is used. And if they are not able to make that decision, then their representative needs to be the one that does that. But really, the goal is to ensure that there continues to be access to that resident, that there needs to be engagement with that person, but also it's a tool that can be used to help protect them as well. And I think that, whatever we can do to protect a resident, we need to be, moving in that direction as long as we have their input and their consent.
Great.
Great talking to you about this today, Leilani.
Great talking with you about this too. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Ethics in Elder Mistreatment. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube or Spotify so you don't miss future conversations exploring ethical dilemmas in elder abuse prevention and intervention.